Section 5 of the Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. Matilda of Flanders, Chapter 3, Part 1. The feud between her royal husband and her firstborn was very painful to Matilda, whose anxious attempts to effect a reconciliation were unavailing. When Robert's passion was somewhat cooled, he consented to see his father, but the interview was anything but friendly. Orduricus Vitalis gives the following particulars of the conference. Robert assumed a very high tone and repeated his demand of being invested with the duchies of Normandy and Maine. This was of course refused by the conqueror, who sternly bade his ambitious heir remember the fate of Absalom and the misfortunes of Rehoboam, and not to listen to the evil counselors who wished to seduce him from the paths of duty. On which Robert insolently replied, that he did not come there to listen to sermons, with which he had been nauseated by his tutors when he was learning grammar, but to claim the investiture which he had been promised. Answer me positively, continued he. Are not these things my right? Have you not promised to bestow them on me? It is not my custom to strip till I go to bed, replied the conqueror, and as long as I live, I will not deprive myself of my native realm, Normandy, neither will I divide with another, for it is written in the holy evangelists, every kingdom that is divided against itself shall become desolate. I won England by my own good sword. The vicars of Christ placed the diadem of its ancient kings on my brow, and the scepter in mine hand. And I swear that all the world combined shall not compel me to delegate my power to another. It is not to be borne, that he who owes his existence to me should aspire to be my rival in mine own dominions. But Robert scornfully rejoined, with equal pride and disrespect, if it be inconvenient for you to keep your word, I will withdraw from Normandy, and seek justice from strangers, for here I will not remain as a subject. With these words he quitted the royal presence, and, with a party of disaffected nobles, took refuge with Matilda's brother, Robert, Earl of Flanders, surnamed Le Frison, for his having married the Countess of Friesland. From this uncle Robert received very bad advice, and the King of France endeavoured, by all the means in his power, to widen the breach between the undutiful heir of Normandy and his father. Encouraged by these evil counselors, Robert busied himself in fomenting discontents, and organizing a formidable faction in his father's dominions, whence he drew large sums, in the shape of presents and loans, from the many vassals of the ducal crown, who were willing to ingratiate themselves with the heir apparent, and to conciliate the favor of the queen duchess, whose partial fondness for her eldest son was well known. The supplies thus obtained Robert improvidently lavished upon his dissolute companions, both male and female. In consequence of this extravagance, he was occasionally reduced to the greatest inconvenience. When under the pressure of those pecuniary embarrassments, which could not fail to expose him to the contempt of the foreign princes who espoused his quarrel against his father, he was wont to apply to his too indulgent mother, Matilda, by whom he was so passionately beloved, that she could refuse him nothing. From her private coffers she secretly supplied him with large sums of silver and gold, and when these resources were exhausted by the increasing demands of her prodigal son, Matilda had the weakness to strip herself of her jewels and precious garments for the same purpose. This system continued even when Robert had taken up arms against his father and sovereign. Roger de Beaumont, that faithful minister, whom William had, previous to his first embarkation on the memorable expedition from St. Valery, appointed as the premier of Normandy, and who had ever since assisted his royal mistress, not only with his counsels in the administration of affairs of state, but even in the education of her children, felt it his duty to inform his sovereign of the underhand proceedings of Matilda in favour of her rebel son. William was in England when the startling intelligence reached him of the unnatural rebellion of his firstborn, and the treachery of his beloved consort, in whom he had ever reposed the most unbounded confidence. He appears scarcely to have given credence to the representations of Roger de Beaumont relating to the conduct of his queen, till, on his return to Normandy, he intercepted one of Matilda's private agents, named Sampson, who was charged with communications from the queen to Robert, which left no doubt on William's mind of the identity of the secret friend by whom his undutiful son had been supplied with the means of carrying on his plots and hostile measures against his government. There was a stern grandeur, not unmixed with tenderness, in the reproof which he addressed to his offending consort on this occasion. The observation of a certain philosopher is true, he said, and I have only too much cause to admit the force of his words. Now fragium rerum est mulier malefida marito. The woman who deceives her husband is the destruction of her own house. Where in the world could you have found a companion so faithful and devoted in his affection? Continued he, passionately. Behold my wife, she whom I have loved as my own soul, to whom I have confided the government of my realms, my treasure, and all that I possess in the world, of power and greatness. She hath supported mine adversary against me. She hath strengthened and enriched him from the wealth which I confided to her keeping. She hath secretly employed her zeal and subtlety in his case, and done everything she could to encourage him against me. Matilda's reply to this indignant but touching appeal, which her royal husband, more, it should appear, in sorrow than in anger, addressed to her, is no less remarkable for its impassioned eloquence than the subtlety with which she evades the principal point on which she is pressed, and entrenches herself on the strong ground of maternal love. My lord, she says, I pray you not to be surprised if I feel a mother's tenderness for her firstborn son. By the virtue of the Most High, I protest that if my son Robert were dead, and hidden far from the sight of the living, 7 feet deep in the earth, and that the price of my blood could restore him to life, I would cheerfully bid it flow. For his sake I would endure any suffering, yea, things from which, on any other occasion, the feebleness of my sex would shrink with terror. How then can you suppose that I could enjoy the pomp and luxuries with which I was surrounded, when I knew that he was pining in want and misery? Far from my heart be such hardness, nor ought your authority to impose such insensibility on a mother. William is reported to have turned pale with anger at this rejoinder. It was not, however, on Matilda, the object of his adoring and constant affection, that he prepared to inflict the measure of vengeance which her transgression against him had provoked. Sampson, the comparatively innocent agent whom she had employed in this transaction, was doomed to pay the dreadful penalty of the offense, with the loss of sight, by the order of his enraged sovereign. In such cases it is usual for the instrument to be the sacrifice, and persons of the kind are generally yielded up, as a sort of scapegoat, or expiatory victim. But Matilda did not abandon her terrified agent in his distress. She contrived to convey a hasty intimation of his peril, and her desire of preserving him, to some of the persons who were devoted to her service. And Sampson, more fortunate than his illustrious namesake of yore, was enabled to escape the cruel sentence of his lord, by taking sanctuary in the monastery of Ouchy, of which Matilda was a munificent patroness. Nevertheless, as it was a serious thing to oppose the wrath of such a prince as William, the abbot Manier found no other way of securing the trembling fugitive from his vengeance than that of causing him to be shorn, shaven, and professed a monk of Ouchy, the same day he entered the convent, in happy hour both of his body and soul, observes the contemporary chronicler who relates this circumstance. It does not appear that William's affection for Matilda suffered any material diminution in consequence of these transactions, neither would he permit any one to censure her conduct in his presence. She was the love of his youth, the solace of his meridian hours of life, and she preserved her empire over his mighty heart to the last hour of her life. But though the attachment of the Conqueror to his consort remained unaltered, the happiness of the royal pair was materially impaired. Robert, their firstborn, was in arms against his father and sovereign, and at the head of a numerous army, supported by the hostile power of France on the one hand, and the disaffected portion of William's subjects on the other. He made a formidable attack on Rouen, and in several instances obtained successes which at first astonished his indignant parent, who had certainly greatly underrated the military talents of his heir. When, however, the Conqueror perceived that the filial foe, who had thus audaciously displayed his rebel banner against him, had inherited all the martial prowess of his race, and was by no means unlikely to prove a match for himself in the art of war, he arrayed a mighty army, and advanced with all his wonted energy to give him battle, not doubting but that success would, as usual, attend his arms. The royal chiefs of Normandy met in hostile encounter, on the plain of Archembray, near the castle of Gerberg. William Rufus, the Conqueror's favourite son, was in close attendance on his father's person that day. This prince had already received the honour of knighthood from Lanfranc, Archbishop of Canterbury, his tutor, and he was eager to assist in humbling the pride of his elder brother, over whom the Conqueror anticipated a signal victory. The battle was fought with no common fury on both sides, but Robert, who headed a choice body of cavalry, decided the fortune of the day, by his impetuous charge upon the rearward of his foes, where his royal father commanded, whose utmost endeavours to preserve order in his ranks were ineffectual. It was in this charge that the memorable personal encounter between the Conqueror and his rebel son occurred, where Robert, unconscious who the doughty champion was against whom he tilted, ran his father through the arm with his lance, and unhorsed him. This was the first time that William had ever been overcome in single combat, for he was one of the strongest men, and most approved knights, of the age in which he lived, and it is a singular fact, that in all battles in which he had been engaged, he had never lost a drop of blood, till it was in this field drawn by the lance of his firstborn. He was on this occasion in great danger of being slain in the melee, but transported with rage at the smart of his wound, and the disgrace of the overthrow, he called so loudly and angrily for rescue, that Robert recognized him, either by his voice or some of his favorite expletives, and hastily alighted, raising him from the ground in his arms, with much tenderness and respect, expressed the deepest concern at the unintentional crime of which he had been guilty, for which he most humbly entreated his forgiveness, and then placing him on his own horse, he brought him safely out of the press. According to some of the historians of that period, William, instead of meeting this generous burst of feeling on the part of his penitent son, with answering emotions of paternal tenderness, was so infuriated at the humiliation he had received, that he uttered a malediction against him, which all the after submissions of Robert could not induce him to retract; while others, equally deserving of credit, assert that he was so moved with the proof of Robert's dutiful reverence for his person, and the anxiety he had manifested for his safety, that he presently forgave him, and ever after held him in better respect. Both accounts may be true in part, for it is very possible, that when the Conqueror of England found himself defeated by his rebel subjects on his native soil, and his hitherto invincible arm overcome by the prowess of his son, whose person he had hitherto been accustomed to mention with a contemptuous allusion to his inferiority in stature, he might, while the smart of his wound lasted, have indulged in a strong ebullition of wrathful reproach, not unmixed with execrations, of which it appears that he, in common with all Normans of that era, had an evil habit. But after his passion was abated, it is certain that he did, in compliance with the entreaties of his queen, consent to receive the submission of his victorious but penitent son. In this battle, William Rufus was severely wounded, as well as his father, and there was a considerable slaughter of the English troops, of which the Conqueror's army was chiefly composed. For Robert had stolen the hearts of the Normans, while associated in the regency with his mother Matilda, and his father considered it unsafe to oppose him with his native troops. As it was, Robert remained the master of the field, having that day given indubitable proofs of able generalship and great personal valor. But the perilous chance that had nearly rendered him the murderer of his father made so deep an impression on his mind, that he remained for a time conscience stricken, which caused him to endeavour, by employing the intercession of his doting mother, to obtain a reconciliation with his offended sire. Matilda had suffered greatly in mind, during the unnatural warfare between her husband and her firstborn, especially after the frightful circumstance of their personal encounter in the field of Archambault, which was fought in the year 1077. Some feelings of self-reproach might possibly mingle with her uneasiness on this occasion. Her health began to decline, and William was at length moved by her incessant pleading, and the sight of her tears, to write a letter with his own hand to Robert, inviting him to repair to Rouen, and receive a full pardon for his late rebellion, promising at the same time to grant him everything that he could expect from the affection of a father, consistently with the duty of a king. On the receipt of this welcome letter, Robert delayed not a moment to obey the summons. He came to Rouen, attended only by 3 servants. He was received by his parents in the most affectionate manner, and a temporary reconciliation was effected between him and his brethren. Matilda did not long enjoy the society of this beloved son, for the Conqueror's affairs in England required his presence. He thought proper to carry Robert with him, under the pretense that he required his services in a military capacity, to defend the northern counties against the aggression of Malcolm, King of Scotland, who had once more violated the treaty of peace. William's real motive for making Robert the companion of his voyage was because he considered Matilda was too much devoted to the interests of her firstborn, to render it expedient for him to remain with her in Normandy. The following spring, Robert was commissioned to chastise the Scottish monarch, but having been given an ineffectual force, he performed nothing remarkable in that campaign. While in the north, he founded the town of Newcastle upon Tyne, in the same place where Monkchester, or the city of the monks, was situated. The year 1078 was remarkable, in this country, for the great national survey, which was instituted by the Conqueror, for the purpose of ascertaining the precise nature of the lands and tangible property throughout England, so that, says Ingulphus, there was not a hide of land, water, or waste, but he knew the valuation, the owners and possessors, together with the rents and profits thereof, as also of all cities, towns, villages, hamlets, monasteries, and religious houses, causing also all the people in England to be numbered, their names to be taken, with notice what any one might dispend by the year, their substance, money, and bonded men recorded, with their cattle, and what service they owed to him, who held of him in fee, all which was certified upon the oaths of commissioners. Such is the account given by the learned abbot Reydon of the particulars of William's great terror, or Doomsday Book, as it was called by the Saxons. The proceedings of the commissioners were inquisitorial enough, no doubt, since they extended to ascertaining how much money every man had in his house, and what was owing to him. That in some instances, too, they were partial in their returns, is evident, by the acknowledgment of Ingulphus, when, speaking of his own monastery of Croyland, he says, "The commissioners were so kind and civil that they did not give in the true value of it." We may therefore conclude that, whenever the proprietors made it worth their while, they were equally obliging elsewhere. Yet it was at the risk of severe punishment that any fraud, favor, connivance, or concealment was practised, by either the owners of the property or the commissioners. Robert of Gloucester, in his rhyming chronicle, gives the following quaint description of the Doomsday Book. Then King William, to learn the worth of his land, let inquiry stretch throughout all England, how many ploughland and hiden also were in every shire, and what they were worth thereto, and the rents of each town, and the waters each one, the worth and woods eke, and wastes where lived none, by that he wist what he were worth of all England, and it set clearly forth that all might understand, and had it clearly written, that script he put, I wis, in the treasury of Westminster, where it still is. The king's great object in instituting this survey was to form an exact calculation of his own revenues, and especially how much money he might be enabled to realize in the way of a land tax. Accordingly, he laid an impost of 6 shillings on every hide of land throughout England as soon as he had ascertained this point, which tax affected the Normans, who had become, generally speaking, the lords of the soil, far more than it did the English, who were for the most part reduced to abject poverty. The description or survey of England was written in 2 books, the Great and Little Domesday Book, and when finished they were carefully laid up in the king's treasury or exchequer, to be consulted on occasion, or as Polydore Virgil shrewdly observes, when it was required to know how much more wool the English flocks might be fleeced. By aid of this survey, William was enabled to raise the royal revenue to the sum of 400,000 per year, which is computed by Brady to be upwards of 5 millions of our present money. In addition to this settled income, he was entitled to many perquisites, as mulcts, fines, forfeitures, licenses for buying and selling, for granting leave to marry, and many other profitable contingencies, which were in those days constantly bringing supplies to the royal purse. Then there were certain occasions on which subsidies were granted as a matter of course, as on the marriage of an eldest daughter, or when knighthood was conferred on a son. Matilda, though residing chiefly in Normandy, had her distinct revenues, perquisites, and privileges as Queen of England. She was allowed to claim her aurum reginae, or queen gold, that is, the 10th part of every fine voluntary that was paid to the crown. She received, from the city of London, sums to furnish oil for her lamp, wood for her hearth, and tolls or imposts on goods landed at Queenhithe, with many other immunities, which the queen consorts in latter days have not ventured to claim. The table at which the queen herself sat was furnished with viands, at the daily expenditure of 40 shillings. 12 pence each was allowed for the sustenance of her 100 attendants. The royal revenues were never richer than in this reign, and they were not charged with any of the expenses attendant on the maintenance of the military force of the country, for the king had taken care to impose that burden on such persons among his followers who had been enriched with the forfeited lands of the Anglo-Saxons. Almost every landed proprietor then held his estates in the tenure of performing crown service, and furnishing a quota of men-at-arms at the king's need or pleasure. In this reign, the Court of Exchequer was instituted, so called from the checkered cloth, figured like a chessboard, that was laid on the table when the court was sitting. The principal or supreme court of judicature in ordinary was called Curia Regis, or King's Court, which was always in the royal residence. There councils were held, and all affairs of state transacted. There the throne was placed, which was an ordinary court of judicature, where justice was administered to the subjects by the king, as chief magistrate. The chief officers of this court were, first, the grand justiciary. He was next to the king in power and authority, and in his absence governed the realm as viceroy. If the king were not present in person in curia regis, he acted as chief judge, both in criminal and civil causes. Second, the constable. He was a high officer, both in peace and war. This office was anciently hereditary. Third, the mareschal. This office is still hereditary, and is at present exercised by his grace the Duke of Norfolk. The office of mareschal, or earl marshal, was to provide for the security of the royal person in the palace, to distribute lodgings there, not always the most enviable task in those bellicose days, and to preserve peace and order in the king's household. How the latter duty was performed when the mareschal chanced to be himself one of the most quarrelsome persons in the court, as in the case of Bigod, Earl of Norfolk, our authority saith not. It was also the business of the Earl Marshal to assist in determining all controversies. There is a notable one on record that took place between King Edward I and his mareschal, the said Bigod, which we shall relate among the events of that reign. The fourth great officer of the king's court was the seneschal or steward of the palace, called the dapifer. The fifth was the chamberlain, who presided over all matters of courtly ceremony. The sixth was the king's chancellor, generally some famous ecclesiastic. The chancellor was the king's prime counsellor, and was accustomed to supervise the charters to be sealed with the king's seal, and likewise to supervise and seal the acts and precepts that issued in proceedings from curia regis, or the king's court. The seventh officer was the king's treasurer, and he was also most frequently a prelate or noted churchman. Besides these, there was le boteleur, or the king's butler, who presided over the royal cellars, and served the wine cup to the sovereign. The sewer, whose business it was to place the dishes on the royal table, and many other officers, of inferior reckoning in the household, but who were nevertheless nobles or knights. We have been thus minute in our particulars of the first Anglo-Norman court, because, although it was little graced by the presence of the queen, its arrangements form the model and precedent for those in the succeeding reigns, and cast no little light on the habits and customs of royalty in the Middle Ages of English history. We must now return to the personal history of Matilda. The latter years of this queen were spent in Normandy, where she continued to exercise the functions of government for her royal husband. Orduricus Vitalis relates the particulars of a visit which she paid to the monastery of Ouchy, to entreat the prayers of the abbot Manier and his monks, in behalf of her second daughter, the Lady Constance, the wife of Alan Fergeant, Duke of Bretagne. This princess, who was passionately desirous of bringing an heir to Bretagne, was childless, and to the grief of her mother had fallen into a declining state of health. Matilda, in the hope of averting the apprehended death of the youthful duchess, sought the shrine of St. Eurolle, the patron of the monks of Ouchy, with prayers and offerings. She was most honorably received by the learned abbot Manier and his monks, who conducted her into the church. She offered a mark of gold on the altar there, and presented to the shrine of St. Eurolle a costly ornament, adorned with precious stones, and she vowed many benefits in reversion, if the saint were propitious. After this the queen duchess dined in the common refectory, behaving at the same time with the most edifying humility, so as to leave an agreeable remembrance of her visit in the minds of the brethren, of whom the worthy chronicler, who relates this circumstance to the honor and glory of his convent, was one. Matilda found that her visit and offerings to the shrine of St. Eurolle were unavailing to prolong the life of her daughter, for the Duchess Constance died in the flower of her age, after an unfruitful marriage of 7 years. Her remains were conveyed to England, and interred in the abbey of St. Edmund's Bury. Like all the children of William and Matilda, she had been carefully educated, and is said to have been a princess possessed of great mental acquirements. After her death, Alan, Duke of Bretagne, married again, and had a family by his second wife. But the rich grant of English lands, with which the Conqueror had dowered his daughter Constance, he was permitted to retain, together with the title of Earl of Richmond, which was long borne by the Dukes of Bretagne, his successors. The grief which the early death of her daughter caused Matilda was soon succeeded by feelings of a still more painful nature, the result of a fresh difference between her royal husband and her beloved son Robert. Some historians assert that this was occasioned by the refusal of the prince to marry the young and lovely heiress of Earl Waltheow, which greatly displeased his father, who was desirous of conciliating his English subjects by such an alliance, and at the same time of making some atonement for the murder of the unfortunate Saxon chief, which always appears to have been a painful subject of reflection to him. About this time, Matilda, hearing that a German hermit of great sanctity was possessed of the gift of prophecy, sent to entreat his prayers for her jarring son and husband, and requested his opinion on the subject of their dissension. The hermit gave a very affectionate reception to the envoys of the queen, but demanded 3 days before he delivered his reply to her questions. On the 3rd day he sent for the messengers, and gave his answer, in the following strain of oracular allegory. "Return to your mistress," he said, "and tell her I have prayed to God in her behalf, and the Most High has made known to me in a dream the things she desires to learn. I saw in my vision a beautiful pasture, covered with grass and flowers, and a noble charger feeding therein. A numerous herd gathered round about, eager to enter and share the feast, but the fiery charger would not permit them to approach near enough to crop the flowers and herbage. But alas! The majestic steed, in the midst of his pride and courage, died, his terror departed with him, and a poor silly steer appeared in his place, as the guardian of the pasture. Then the throng of meaner animals, who had hitherto feared to approach, rushed in, and trampled the flowers and grass beneath their feet, and that which they could not devour, they defiled and destroyed. I will explain the mystery couched in this parable. The steed is William of Normandy, the conqueror of England, who, by his wisdom, courage, and power, keeps the surrounding foes of Normandy in awe. Robert is the dull, inactive beast who will succeed him, and then those baser sort of animals, the envious princes, who have long watched for the opportunity of attacking this fair fruitful pasture, Normandy, will overrun the land, and destroy all the prosperity which its present sovereign has established. Illustrious lady, if, after hearing the words of the vision, in which the Lord has vouchsafed to reply to my prayers, you do not labor to restore the peace of Normandy, you will henceforth behold nothing but misery, the death of your royal spouse, the ruin of all your race, and the desolation of your beloved country. This clever apologue, in which some sagacious advice was implied, Matilda took for prediction, and this idea, together with the increasing dissensions in her family, pressed heavily on her mind, and are supposed to have occasioned the lingering illness which slowly but surely conducted her to the tomb. This illness was attended with great depression of spirits. She endeavored to obtain comfort by redoubling her devotional exercises and alms. She confessed her sins frequently and with bitter tears. It is to be hoped that a feeling of true penitence was mingled with the affliction of the queen, who, at the highest pinnacle of earthly grandeur, afforded a melancholy exemplification of the vanity and insufficiency of the envied distinctions with which she was surrounded, and was dying of a broken heart. As soon as William, who was in England, was informed of the danger of his beloved consort, he hastily embarked for Normandy, and arrived at Caen in time to receive her last farewell. After Matilda had received the consolations of religion, she expired on the 2nd of November, or, according to some historians, the 3rd of that month, anno 1083, in the 52nd year of her age, having borne the title of Queen of England 17 years, and Duchess of Normandy upwards of 31. Her body was carried to the convent of the Holy Trinity at Caen, which she had built and munificently endowed. The corpse of the Queen Duchess was reverentially received, at the portal of the church, by a numerous procession of bishops and abbots, conducted within the choir, and deposited before the high altar. Her obsequies were celebrated with great pomp and solemnity by the monks and clerks, and attended by a vast concourse of the poor, to whom she had been throughout life a generous benefactress, and frequently, says Orduricus Vitalis, relieved with bounteous alms in the name of her Redeemer. A magnificent tomb was raised to her memory by her sorrowing lord, adorned with precious stones and elaborate sculpture, and her epitaph, in Latin verse, was emblazoned thereon in letters of gold, setting forth in pompous language the lofty birth and noble qualities of the illustrious dead. The following is a translation of the quaint monkish rhymes, which defy the imitative powers of modern poetry. Here rests within this fair and stately tomb Matilda, scion of regal line, the Flemish duke her sire, and Adelaide her mother, to great Robert, king of France, daughter and sister to his royal heir. In wedlock to our mighty William joined. She built this holy temple, and endowed with lands and goodly gifts. She, the true friend of piety and soother of distress, enriching others, indigent herself. Reserving all her treasure for the poor, and, by such deeds as these, she merited to be partaker of eternal life, to which she passed November 2nd, 1083. End of section 5.